Hi, I'm OJ Trevino. I am a descendant of Silvia Hector Webber. I am also the secretary of the Webber Family Preservation Project. Today, I will be talking a little bit about Silvia. I will be talking about the history and the importance and the role that she played in the Underground Railroad into Mexico. And I will also be talking about Mexico's role in what they did with the Underground Railroad. I'll be sharing a little bit about the history and just some of the important aspects of that with our information being hidden, the depiction of this history, and some of those things there. So these are kind of the three main topics that I'll be hitting on today. But we can go from there and as we go through this. Again, I'm part of the Webber Family Preservation Project. There's a QR code up at the top corner that you can go visit our website and see any information that I'm talking about today or a little bit more in depth. So, Silvia Hector Webber was born in 1807 in Louisiana, the West Florida Territory. Documented at the age of 8 with her mother, Sarah, at the age of 26. We found this information recently going through some research. And these are the first and earliest signs that we have of Silvia and her mother together. Silvia was then sold and separated from her mother initially at age 9. We found records again in 1819 as the first bill of sale from Silas McDaniel to Morgan Cryer in Pike County, Arkansas, sold for the price of $550. She was then taken to Texas in 1826 by John Cryer, and she was denied the freedom that she was owed to her per Mexico's Federal Act of 1824. Now, this is important, and I'll talk a little bit about it later as well, talking about Mexico's role with this. But this is important because Mexico had set up this information or this act here. And in 1824, as of 1824, anyone brought into Texas was to be free. Okay, but she was denied that, along with any other enslaved persons that were brought into Mexico at that time, were denied these freedoms that they were owed under Mexico. She met John F. Webber between the years of 1826 and 1829. We're not real sure exactly when they met. We don't know exactly the circumstances as to when they met. Again, I'll be talking a little bit later on as to how John came and was in Texas. But during those years, we know that they met. John was a tobacco smuggler in Texas, had some sort of a association with John Cryer, and that is how they met and Silvia met. John Cryer, again, was the son of Morgan Cryer and inherited Silvia from Morgan Cryer. Now, while enslaved, after John and Silvia met, she gave birth to their first child in October of 1829. By 1834, they had had 3 children. And it's important to note here that as I mentioned, while enslaved. And we have to kind of understand the context of those things, because while people were enslaved, their right to consent was limited, right? Because they were enslaved. So that is a very important aspect of this. Now, in 1834, Silvia and John secured her freedom and that of their 3 children at the time from John Cryer. Now, again, this is very important to say, is they secured their freedom directly from John Cryer. So John Webber never owned Silvia Hector. This was a direct freedom set from an agreement from John Cryer. Now, in those records, John Cryer asked for some specificities on that, and to that being, he wanted, in return for the freedom of Silvia and their 3 children, in return, he wanted 2 children, other children, under the age of 2. Now, along with that contract as well, what John and Sylvia did in there is, if they did not pay that price, they had put as collateral their land that they were residing in Webberville, which is just east of Austin. They put that land up from collateral, and I will go in a little bit more into detail on that as well later. But in that, they put that land as collateral. And that's important to note because we find records later showing that indeed John and Sylvia did not pay in a life for a life, but rather they forfeited their land in Webberville as payment for Sylvia's freedom and that of their three children at the time. Now, as I said, Sylvia became the first settler of Webberville. At that point in time was known as Webber's Prairie. In March of 1850, the Webbers had to forfeit their land of Webberville to John Cryer as part of this contract that they had signed on June 11th, 1834. They forfeited that land to John Cryer, and at that time, I believe it was roughly 550 acres, 850 acres, I believe, somewhere in that range. And now it's also important to note that the price by that time in 1850 had raised from $1 an acre in value to up to $15 a dollar in per acre. In some cases, there's even a little script in there. In some cases, there were parts of it that were even worth potentially up to $25. So the value by the time they forfeited this land had grown 15 to 25 times in value. We found these records, or records of this transaction was found in Travis County by Dr. Hammock, Maria Esther Hammock. And in 1850, the family, along with their family tutor, were run out of town. As more settlers started coming in, as more white settlers really started coming in and realizing that this was an interracial couple. Not only that, they were educating their children and their interracial children, and the town or other people did not like that. So they ended up running the family out of town and running them out of their own town. And so they had to escape from the persecution from that. So in 1851, between 1851 and 1853, the Webbers arrived in Mexico and then settled in South Texas. So 1851, we have also found records of the Webber family settling in Mexico first and buying land in Mexico first. Excuse me. Finding land in Mexico first and living there for a few years before eventually coming across back into Texas and purchasing land in Texas in 1853. Now they purchased 8,856,000 acres, 8,856 acres in Texas at that time. It also shows we've got records showing that they operated a ferry that helped others gain freedom and travel into South Texas. This was not the only ferry that they operated either. We've got records showing that they had a ferry in Webberville area too. Now, it's also important to note that in the Webberville area and also in South Texas area, both of those lands that they owned were by bodies of water. And as I mentioned, they had ferries that they operated on both of those areas. So they were helping along the way, no matter where they lived, operating ferries along bodies of water to help people gain their freedom. In the 1860s, for safety, Sylvia, along with her girls and the younger children, moved back into Texas. Were living in Texas without John while he stayed at the ranch in Texas. This was for the safety because, again, in the 1860s, there was starting to be a lot of tribulations there and issues between Texas or U.S. Texas and Mexico and what they were trying to do there. So for that safety, Sylvia and the girls and the younger children went back into Texas, or into Mexico, I'm sorry, to live in Mexico. Now, during 1861 and 1865, as we know, that was the U.S. Civil War. John F. Webber and their sons were sought after by Colonel Rip Ford during this time because they were known Union sympathizers. They were even arrested by Rip Ford at this time. One of their sons was able to escape, made his way down to Bronzeville, warned uh, the Union Army there that Confederate Army had arrived in South Texas and were there. John and their sons went on to live in Mexico after their release and lived there until the 1880s. They all returned back to the ranch, the Webber Ranch there in South Texas, and John later died in 1882. Sylvia lived on that ranch and collected a widow's pension for John's participation in the War of 1812 until her death in 1892. So now another aspect that I want to note here is that we can see here, I've put some asterisks on some of these records that we have found here. And so I want to make sure that we give credit to those that are finding those records and are doing the research and finding those records. So Sylvia's original bill of sale that we found, that was records found by Leslie Trevino, which is my wife. The records of Sylvia's Freedom Papers and the records of Travis County records of them forfeiting the land were found by Dr. Maria Esther Hammock. Along with this, the records that we have of them owning land in Mexico and Texas are part of the Mellon project that we're working on, Mellon Foundation project that we are working on. And those belong to the Webber Family Preservation Project digital archives. All right, so now we're moving on to Mexico's role as a haven against U.S. enslavement. Right, so during this time, from 1821 to 1836, Texas was part of Mexico. And this is kind of really one of those important things that really gets overlooked a lot of times and doesn't really get talked about when we're talking history and we're shown history here in the United States. A lot of this information here is overlooked. It's not really talked about, and it's important to know exactly what was going on, right? This is part of our history that is being hidden, and I will talk a little bit more of that later as well. But these are important aspects of this time that show context as to why things were going on at that time. All right, so Mexico had contracted Stephen F. Austin to offer some land grants, and this is known as the original 300. And so they had contracted with Stephen F. Austin to allow him to bring in some settlers so that Mexican Texas could be populated at that time. Right now, as part of that contract, though, they had to relinquish, anyone coming in and settling had to relinquish their U.S. citizenship and become Mexican citizens. Right. This is something, again, as I mentioned, that is not really mentioned. It's not really taught when we're learning this history. Another aspect of this contract was anyone born in Texas was to be born free. This included enslaved persons, right? Especially enslaved persons. If they were born in Texas, they were to be born free. And again, as I mentioned, these were some of those freedoms that were denied by these settlers that were coming in. All right. Another part of this contract was after 10 years, any enslaved persons that were brought into Texas as part of those land grants would be free. And they were not allowed to traffic any more enslaved persons into Texas after that time. Again, these are all contentious stipulations that those settling as part of the land grants that were coming in from other parts of the U.S. really didn't agree with, but these were the terms that were set for this, right? Another aspect of this is we've got the Federal Act of 1824. This prohibited in territory of the United States of Mexico the commerce and traffic of slaves arriving from any foreign power and under any flag. Again, if they were brought into Texas, once they set foot, they were to be freed. Again, this law decreed All enslaved persons who are introduced from this day forward, contrary to this decree, gain their full freedom as soon as they set foot in Mexican territory, right? Mexican territory, again, was the state of Texas. Okay, now during this time in 1829, Vicente Guerrero becomes the second president of Mexico. He is the first Mexican president of Black and Indigenous descent. So this was back in 1829, way before the U.S. has even considered having a Black president. I believe now also Mexico has had two Black presidents before the United States even had its first and only Black president. As part of Vicente Guerrero's uh, presidency, he abolished slavery with the Guerrero Decree in 1829. Right, again, this is stating that every person is to be free, and there was not to have the institution of slavery be in Mexican Texas or any part of Mexico. Right. In 1850, after Texas became its own union, there was a Fugitive Slave Act. Right. So this was part of U.S. saying that if any enslaved persons reached either U.S. Or I'm sorry, Canada territory or Mexican territory, those countries were to bring those enslaved persons back into the United States or notify the United States that enslaved persons were there. Mexico did not support this and would not participate in this. On the contrary, Mexico actually fought for this with military force and did not allow any slave catchers to come into Mexico to try and re-enslave any free persons at that time. Canada, however, they did participate in this Fugitive Slave Act, and they would either call on to the U.S. and say, hey, there are enslaved persons here, or they would take them back or just allow slave catchers to come into Canada and capture people and re-enslave them. But as I mentioned, it's very important to note Mexico did not participate in this. Right? We also see that in Alice Baumgartner's book South to Freedom, she discusses the freedom principle. Part of this freedom principle was in March 22nd of 1849, Mexico's Congress decreed that the slaves of other countries would be free by the act of stepping on national territory. Right. So again, Mexico was really fighting for the freedom of persons in Mexico. And this is something that Silvia and John both really strongly believed in, and something that they participated in helping enslaved persons reach freedom, right? Part of them living in Mexico, having land in Mexico and on the U.S. side, is they were able to do this, right? They were able to help people into freedom. They were able to help them move along, finding rest, being able to hide, in their home, move into Mexico and find freedom there. This was not something that was easy for them, right? There was along the way. We have to understand that Mexican Texas, and once it became, U.S. Texas, they did not want to free any enslaved persons. They wanted to keep the institution of slavery alive, right? And so this was, again, something that we're not really taught and is kind of overlooked in our history books or, in schools, is this was the reason for the U.S. Civil War, right? Is the southern states, the Union was fighting against it. We had the Confederacy was fighting for it, right? Um, and this is something that the Webber family really had strong ties to, right? Sylvia being formerly enslaved herself and finding that freedom and securing her freedom, wanted to make sure that she allowed and helped others to gain that same freedom. So they participated in this every step of the way as much as they could. Again, as part of this research that's being done right now by the Webber Family Preservation Project, is we are finding documents that are discussing of other people participating and working with the Webber family to travel in and back and forth from into Mexico and into Texas, helping others along the way, right? And this is very important that it's being documented. We have found this documentation because this helps us find for certain that this is something that they were participating in. Um, so this is a very important role. This is something that we are definitely fighting for, to get stories like this out, because these stories are not really talked about. You know, they're not taught in school. They're not really known. Um, there's something that's really contentious right now, and is not wanting to be known. Right? They're trying to keep these stories hidden, and that's something I'm going to be talking about a little bit, later as well. But this is part of what Mexico was doing. This is their part of what they had done for this. This is part of what the Webbers were doing along with this as well. Um, so now what I'm showing here is these are census records that were taken from 3 different decades. So we've got census records from 1850 here on the far left. We've got in the center census records from 1870. And then on the far right, we've got the records from 1880. And so what these records show is initially the first record from 1850. This is from Travis County. And I'm not sure if you all can see my cursor there, but this is in Travis County, and this was taken in 1850. And now what we can see here is that highlighted here, circled here in red, these tick marks here. What this is this shows, and this is a record of people that could read and write in the household, right? So these tick marks here on that column are people that could read and write. This coincides with these are their children. So all of their children could read and write and were taught to read and write. Down here in this line, this is their school teacher that they had. So on their Weber Prairie land, they had established a little school, and this is what their tutor was doing, right? He was teaching their children to read. So each one of their children could read and write. And this was part of the issue, right? That's why they got run out of Weberville. So in the center and second set of records, we've got in July of 1870, they are now living in Hidalgo County. This is when they came back, or when they were in Texas. And we can see here what I've got highlighted here is, and this is kind of important because this shows a distinction between other census records at that time, right? Is it shows here, whoops, my place there, here we go. So it shows here that Silvia is keeping house, right? That is her title, that is her role in this. We can see that John Webber up above that is listed as a farmer. Now, the distinction here is important because there are certain different terms that were used at that time. Keeping house is one of them. Another term that was used during that time is, uh, I'm sorry, what is that term? Babe, help me. Okay, sorry, Sarah. Might have to pause this and cut this part out. What's the term in the census records that were, if they were enslaved? What was the servant, house servant? Okay, sorry, we can cut back in this. So the terms, the distinctive terms that were used in this is um, house servant, right? Is if someone was enslaved and listed in the census records, they were shown as house servant. Silvia, however, is clearly marked there as keeping house, right? So this was her house that she kept. Now we've got the other records in 1880 showing again, as we can see, John is listed as a farmer. Silvia again is listed as keeping house. But another distinction here that we see is right here, she's listed as the wife. right? So she's listed as a wife of John F. Webber. Now, you'll note here that we do not have records of 1860. 1860, that was the time that they were living in Mexico. And also, I believe that census may not have been taken in 1860 because of the Civil War and all those troublesome times that they were having, is that they didn't really have time to do a census, and that was just not important to them at that time. So we don't have records for the 1860 census. Now, here, as part of the Webber Family Preservation Project and what we have done, right, and this is where it is now important to discuss what um, descendant involvement means, right? What that means, what that looks like, um, everything that comes along with that, right? And so being able as a descendant, being able to reclaim that history, being able to learn that history, being able to share that history, that's an important aspect because, as I have mentioned, this history has been hidden for so long, right? And so being and enabling and giving power to the descendants to speak on their history is an important aspect of this because there is a lot of history that the descendants know. There's also a lot of history the descendants don't know, right? So being able to share this allows other descendants to find this information and allows them to learn this information from there. There's also some things to be careful with, right? As descendants, is there's a lot of stories that are told, right? And as we know, as stories are passed down, from one person to another, from generations to another, decades, centuries from one to another, a lot of that information does not stay the same, right? That's how we get legends. That's how we get lore. That's, all of those aspects, right? So we have to be careful with those stories that are shared by descendants, but we have to be able to use those stories to find documentation proving what these stories are, right? And this is a big part of that descendant involvement again, is allowing those descendants to share those stories and use those stories to find the documented evidence so that we can either confirm or deny some of these stories, right? An example that I'll give you is initially when we first started looking up this history, we thought that John F. Webber was a medic in the War of 1812. For so long, that was the information that was found, and this is what was continued to be told, is that he was a medic, right? What we have now found is that he was not a medic in the War of 1812. He was an infantry soldier. And down here on the bottom right, you can see these are records here for his pension records for the War of 1812 that Silvia is listed as the widow for this. So this is records again showing she was able to collect the pension for the War of 1812. But going back to it, this is why it's important to have this history and learn these records to be able to come back and verify and say this is what happened. These are the records that we've got, right? So the descendant involvement is really heavy and really important on this. Another aspect of this, as you see on the top left, these are the original freedom papers that we have for Sylvia. These were found in the Dolph Briscoe Center at the University of Texas, again by Dr. Maria Esther Hammock. She found these records while she was studying for her PhD and acquiring her PhD at the University of Texas. This was part of her thesis. She found these records late one night, just by happenstance, as she was going through these records. These records were not listed in there. It was an undocumented box. It was just a miscellaneous box. It's marked, I think, something along the lines of just Texas records, something general. And she just happened to pull that and look through it late one night. This was the last box that she went through and ended up finding these freedom papers, right? This is another aspect of why it's important and how we need to change how we do things and how we keep records and how we keep archives. Because a lot of these archives, and I'll go into a little bit further into depth in this, but a lot of these archives are unmarked and just marked as miscellaneous, right? So had it not been for Dr. Hammock and her persistence to continue looking through records, these records may have never been found, and we would not be here allowing us to speak and share Sylvia's story. Um, a part of finding these records, we were able to have down on the bottom left, have an exhibit put on by the Briscoe and the Webber Family Preservation Project, and have an exhibit that went on for, I believe it was about a 6-month exhibit that was had displaying these documents and allowing the public to come and see these records. Now, again, it's important that the descendants are involved and allowed to be involved, because finding these records, allowing these records to be shown, allowing the descendants or our organization um, to be part of this was not an easy feat. We had to, and kind of read the little script there, is we had to involve a law firm and get legal involved with this so that we could participate and be part of these records, right? Initially, the Dolph Briscoe wanted to charge the family to see or have a copy of these records and treated us just like the general public or anybody else. But because we were able to establish an organization, we were able to get legal counsel and get legal involved, we had this exhibit to allow the public to come and see these records, not be charged for that, and be able to share the importance of this history. Another part of what we have been able to do here is up on the top right, and we've been able to participate in Juneteenth festivals. Right, this particular is in Edinburgh, South Texas, where we've had a few years now had some tables, and we've been out there again sharing the history, giving information out to the public so that they know what we have and what is going on with this. In the center, you'll see that's a picture of the Webber Cemetery that is still there to this day. These is the family cemetery. This is part of the ranch that the Webber family established in South Texas when they moved to Texas in 1853. This is the only piece of land that is still left in the Webber name and in the Webber Cemetery. This is also where John and Silvia are buried. And this is a continuing effort as part of this Mellon project as well that we are doing, as we are doing more research in this cemetery. And you can find more information on that as we continue with our efforts. At the end of this year, we'll be writing a report. We'll be displaying more information on this, where you can go in and look and learn more of this history of not only the Webber Cemetery, but of the Webber family as well. These are other exhibits that we have had with this, right? We have on top left, we had another exhibit with when we partnered with the African American Museum of Plano. And they worked with us, we worked with them. It was a great collaboration with this, and we had panels discussing the Underground Railroad, right? Discussing Sylvia's story and discussing stories of other women that had gone into Mexico and were part of the Underground Railroad as well, right? And these histories. And we worked with Dr. Rolanda Teal on this. We worked with, again, Dr. Hammock and the Webber Family Preservation Project to do this. So again, the importance, right, of having descendant involvement, learning this history, having these documented proof, and being able to share these is everything that we have had. On the right, top right, this was an exhibit that we had where we partnered, partnered with the Carver Branch Library in San Antonio, Texas. They allowed us to display these panels as well there. This is now a permanent exhibit with the libraries in San Antonio. So if you are in the San Antonio area, you can reach out to the libraries and see where it is at. I believe right now, they are housed in the main San Antonio library. but the exhibit is under the direction of Dr. D.L. Grant there in San Antonio Library System. So you can contact them if you want to go see these panels and learn a little bit more about the Underground Railroad, about other stories, about Silvia's story, about other women that participated in the freedom of others into Mexico. On the bottom left, again, here we had a few years ago in June of 2024, the Today Show came out and interviewed us and talked about Silvia's story, right, and was able to put that out there for this history. I mean, that was something nationwide. So it's important to have all this because little by little, all this uncovered history is being talked about and is being shared with others, right, so that they can learn all this aspect of what happened with the Underground Railroad into Mexico. Again, we learn most of the time everything went up into Canada, went up north. Very little is discussed about what happened and what went down south. So this is part of that with our story and what we are doing and the information that we are trying to share with that and everything that we have been a part of. Again, just last year, we were awarded the grant from the Mellon Foundation, and this has allowed us to continue our efforts to do the research, to travel to do research in certain aspects, to hold symposiums, teaching this history, right, and educating others, not only on the Webber family, but on descendant involvement, right? Being able to track your genealogy, learning how to track your genealogy, learning how to do archival research. These are all parts and aspects of this grant that we are doing by the Webber Family Preservation Project and the Mellon Foundation. You can see here some of the things that we're wanting to do is digital archives, interactive maps, tours of Travis County, which is where Webberville still stands to this day, and the Webber Cemetery, and have all of this access to the public, right, where they can go and find this. These other pictures that are there are some of these travels of some of our, our women leaders in the nonprofit organization that are going and doing this research with different communities and different portions of this, right? And so it's just important. These communities that are shown here are in Mexico, right? There are still communities in Mexico to this day that are heavily involved with this history, right? That have ancestry, that live their Black ancestry, Black communities that are in Mexico that we're reaching out to and working with and have this information. They've got their own organizations they are doing to promote this history. So again, it's descendant led. So descendants involvement is just it's a heavy part of this and allowing this to continue. I'll go back real quick to the beginning here. Um, so again, it's important to share these stories, right, and allowing descendants to be part of this. It's important to be careful and be respectful as to how we present this information, right? It's important not to sensationalize any of these histories, any of these stories, right? It's real easy to fall into catching or getting a catchy title, right? Getting something that's going to catch someone's eye. We live in a era right now where getting the information out quickly, getting it out first is important, right? We've got all the social media that's out there that everybody is just this information is not really vetted, right? It's just as soon as you can get the information out there, it's out there. And now trying to go back and correct some of these stories, trying to correct some of these, uh, narratives that are being put out there makes it a challenge for descendants, makes it a challenge for an organization like ours to accurately depict this information or accurately tell these stories, right? It also it's a danger because that can discredit the true stories that are there. If things get mixed in with inaccuracies or falsities, right, now everything comes into question, All right. So now the information that's there, it all brings it into question. And so that's why it's important that we are careful about how this information gets put out there. We're respectful, but at the same time, not be afraid to correct ourselves, right? And make sure that we have these documented um, records to show what exactly happened, to be able to explain further and put all of this together, right? I mentioned too this part of this hidden information, right? And I was 24, 25 years old when I first learned of my family's history. I am 48 years old now, so roughly half my life, I did not know this history. I did not know this story, right? Part of that reason as to why I didn't know this story and why it was hidden for so long is because of the way we were brought up, right? The way things were back then. So in 1911, after obviously Juneteenth, 1865, and everybody, enslaved persons were now free, right away we had Jim Crow laws that were starting to get put in place, right? Everything was evolving. In 1911, Texas adopted what had already been implemented in other states. Texas adopted in 1911 what was known as the one drop rule. What the one drop rule was, if you had any ancestry of Black descent, you were considered Black. Therefore, you were held under any prejudice that was towards Black people. And as we know, because of Jim Crow laws, there was a lot of um, illegal laws that were put in place, right, for these people. So that was something that was implemented again in 1911. My grandfather was born in 1920. This had already been put in place. This continued on until 1967 with the Loving versus Virginia, that was a federal law that came into place where now interracial marriages were now allowed. Right. By that time in 1967, my mother was already born was already 17 by that age. So that is a long history there where you are forced to hide what your ancestry is, hide who you are for the safety of your family, right? My grandmother, my grandfather would not have been allowed to have gotten married under these under these laws. If it was known that my grandfather was Black or had Black ancestry and therefore considered Black, he would not have been allowed to have an interracial marriage with my grandmother. Therefore, my mom would not be here. I would not be here. Right. And this is the context that we need to understand. This is the importance of learning these histories and sharing these histories so that we understand that. Right. Now, as I said, my grandfather didn't talk about this, denied it, hid that history. My aunts, my uncles, my mother, they didn't know any of this history either. This was, as I mentioned, until 2003, 2004, it was not known to us, right? But it's just we need to be able to now move forward with that and present that. Um, so although my grandfather didn't talk about it, he kept record of it, right? A lot of these records that he held onto and documented are now sitting at a museum in the valley, right? They were donated. He gave those documents to a, uh, a nephew of his who then loaned those documents to a museum in South Texas where those records are held, right? So even though he wasn't speaking on it, my grandfather was keeping those records. We also found a Bible of his after he passed, and he had records dating back from John and Silvia all the way up, I believe, into the early 90s of family being born, right? And kept a record of all that. And that's just a beautiful thing to be able to discover. And fortunately, it was after his death, and we weren't able to talk to him about it. But this is still something that is beautiful and nice to have, right? And be able to see all of that. So he was not he was hiding it for his safety, but he was still tracking everything and very proud of that history. Right. So this is important for us to be able to have that as descendants and be empowered for that. Right. As I mentioned earlier with archives and the way that archives are done and being able to find that history and being able to find that information. Right. A lot of these archives, if you go in, first off, if you are not educated in the ways of knowing how to deal with archives, how to request archives, how to look through archives, you're not going to get in and have access to that, right? That's part of what needs to change. Another part of what needs to change and needs to be made easier is the way these archives are recorded. Right now, the way they're recorded is they're listed either by the enslaver's name or they're listed by the archivist's name. Archivists who have nothing to do with any of this history, any of these records that are in there, right? What is hidden from these archives and what's not listed on these folders, on these titles or anything, are the names of these enslaved people, the names that will allow their descendants to be able to find them and close that gap and close some of those stories and there's those histories, right? To be able to look deeper into that. These names are, you have to go through these records, you have to look through them to be able to find the name of your enslaved, of your descendant, right? To be able to find these names, to put that. If these names are listed on the document, those are the names that should be listed on the folders. These are the titles, the file names, however that we need to record it. Those are the names that need to be made searchable. And this is what will start closing the gap and allowing descendants to be able to find their history, right? There's so much that is unknown because these histories are hard to find. And that's one aspect that we need to change, that we need to look into, and that we need to start doing and fighting for, is giving these and making these records easier to look through, easier to find, right? So this is what's important to have. These are things that are important to me as a descendant. These are things that are important to us as an organization. These are things that we are trying to do. Again, you can see at the top, our motto, our goals is to, help research, help preserve, and help to educate all of this, right? Research all these histories, preserve these histories, and educate ourselves and others on these histories and how to find these histories, right? It's important that we are able to find these, and it doesn't have to be about people that participated in the Underground Railroad or led the Underground Railroad. This is also about people that were led to freedom and found this freedom and went into and fought for this freedom to go in and do this, right? And this is all histories and all stories that need to be told and need to be presented. So this is my presentation for today. Again, I am O.J. Trevino. I am a fifth generation descendant of John and Silvia Webber. I come from their line of Santiago Webber, who was their son. Santiago then had Concepcion Webber, who is my great grandfather, who then had my grandfather Juan Webber, who then had my mother Olga Webber, who then had myself. So this is where, again, it is important to have these histories and have this, because these connections can be made. Being able to learn about my family's history has helped me grow, and has been allowed to be able to get this information out there and share these histories for others to know and be able to get their history as well. So if you would like, as I mentioned, there is a QR code up at the top. My information is here. This is, again, a QR code that will take you to our website. Our website has more information on documentation that we have found. It has the story that Dr. Hammock has written about, or her part of her thesis that she wrote about on Silvia. other work that we are doing as well as part of the Mellon Project. And all of that can be found in there. Again, this is my number, this is my email. Excuse me. If you want, feel free, reach out to me at any time, and I will respond and participate in anything I can. Again, thank you to those. Thank you to the Macri for allowing me to present my family's history, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.